Everyone, welcome to Cable Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick,
And I'm Tony.
and we're in the first round of fighting back against the virtue ethicists. So we're in the middle of our book, Christian Ethics: Four Views, and we're looking at interesting University Press as a series where they have a main question, a main contention, a thought, and they invite different perspectives to come and do a written presentation, and then each of those uh, uh, views gets to respond to the main claim of whoever's presenting it. Unlike the counterpoint series, there's no kind of final summation, so we don't get the beauty of that part, which I do kind of like, and I kind of miss from this as an interesting kind of last couple pages to maybe clarify or
Yeah.
declare victory, maybe.
Yeah, or defeat or whatever.
You're
Yeah.
right. You're right. I
Yeah.
could have done better, which I haven't seen yet, but who knows? Maybe if we find something on defending different points of view of biblical humility, we'll find the best one there. We've already seen the claim for virtue ethics, which kind of to make a dirty summary of is to say that it doesn't so much matter about what things are virtuous, but if you become a virtuous person, then by extension, the things that you do almost because you are virtuous is going to be the right things. Now, there's some nuance in there that I'm throwing out for the sake of
Yes. So the basic idea with virtue ethics is the focus on the person and not the action,
right.
right? Many times we think, is this the morally right thing to do, right? Virtue ethics says, well, the focus should be on being the virtuous person and having Christ's character, right? If you have that, then you will do the morally right thing. That's the basic idea.
Right. And so we think our individual, which I think we were kind of mispronouncing his name, tended to do a good Brad Kallenberg. I think we were adding a burger on too many times when I was editing. So Brad J. Kallenberg was the virtue ethicist, and I thought he made a pretty decent presentation. For the most part, some things maybe a bit in the weeds of where he wanted to go, but there was a good enough response in there that I think presented the case quite well for his side. And so now we're going to look at the three different other points of view. So we have the natural law response. So again, kind of pared down version. So natural law says that God has kind of baked into the world natural laws, like we have gravity. There's also natural laws like things like don't murder, don't steal, and stuff like that. So the person who's responding to that who takes that position is going to respond first. And then we also have the divine command theorist, who says, by extension, we need a type of revelation in order to know what is good and then to carry it out. And then the prophetic ethicist is someone who's focused more on kind of the corporate view of sin in response to ethics. And so I think I've kind of tipped our hand maybe a little bit in the short clips that I've made. If you've seen this, this is kind of the neo-orthodoxy reared again. We can call it other things, but for the sake of trying to be fair, I think that's how I'll term it for that. So kind of focusing more on we need to take a look at kind of the social justice or doing more corporately than individualistically, especially when it comes to forming and changing societies. So
Right. And we'll see as we go through each of these kind of rebuttals to the virtue ethicists that their particular position is going to come through loud and clear.
right. Yes. And so we won't be pulling any punches, but at the same time, too, we encourage you, if you think this is interesting, to grab the book because, of course, we're not covering everything. We're kind of covering even the things that we think is important. Maybe there's something that we didn't pull that you might find more important, or maybe there's a example there that will formulate the point home more for you, and we're leaving out. So that's always our caveat is, we're providing fair use commentary to the books that we're reading here. So that's what we'll do here. All right. So Claire Brown Peterson is the person who's going to respond from the natural law response point of view. And I'll wait to give my clarifications, but I think she provides some interesting context to the differences and also maybe some of the similarities. And I think that we've also seen in kind of our last book that we did when we looked at different point of views for apologetic methods. All right, so she says here, while virtue ethics and natural law ethics are not equivalent views of morality, certain versions of these theories do fit together, and quite naturally so. One indication of this potential fit is in the fact that Christian proponents of both theories can point to the same philosopher, and that's our boy Thomas Aquinas, as their most important historical defender. And so we saw that last time. And of course, anytime anyone mentions natural law, that should automatically spark your ears to think Aquinas. And so Claire Peterson says, I would go so far as to classify the natural ethics that I defend at the heart of Brad Kallenberg's preferred virtue ethics as complementary rather than competing views. So maybe that's an issue for you, or maybe that could be a strength of when you're considering this point of view.
Yeah. And she goes on and says, she says that virtue ethics places a great deal of emphasis on the importance of character, which we already know, and through habit becomes a part of oneself, so that changing one's moral orientation is not a simple matter of resolving to behave in a particular way in the future. As a natural law ethicist, she tells us that she can agree with all of this, right? So it's more than just I'm deciding to change my behavior. It's creating a habit so that my character is affected. That's the idea here. Mm-hmm. And so she says, if I'm to live as a human that is designed to live, right, I must remember this fact as I consider my own moral development. In other words, natural law ethics, as she sees it, will affirm that humans on particular occasions to cultivate out the virtue. So she becomes close to, agreeing with the virtue ethicist, Kallenberg, right? And in fact, she says, she could be considered one.
Right. So again, maybe a strength towards her point of view, or maybe this is a negative. And so she's going to get into kind of why she still will hold the view that she does against
how she's different. Yeah.
Right. So again, very magnanimous of her, and good spirited. So again, one of the benefits of looking at kind of a debate like this is you're reading just the written word, and so yes, there's some critiques that you can do of how people present, because sometimes how people write is not always how people speak. But also, at the same time, you're hoping to get the best version of these argumentations because they do have the time. They're not bound by the audience or trying to make the kitschy point. They're expressing the view that we think best communicates the ideas, and so that's another good reason to kind of view debates as like this. All right, so she then says, I can imagine a reader of this book asking me, well then, why do you call yourself a natural ethicist rather than a virtue ethicist? Very, very clear point here. My answer is that I do consider myself, she says, a virtue ethicist as well as a natural law ethicist, but that I do not consider virtue ethics a standalone ethical theory. So this is an interesting point where she says these two aren't kind of congruent from each other, but that they kind of fall in line. And so how well do they fall in line? Are they parallel? Can you run on either track, or is one the basis of the other? And so she's going to give the context of it. So virtue ethics requires a context, she says, and that context is best provided by the natural law. So she's saying kind of that there's these two run similar to each other, but that she's saying that the natural law provides kind of the basis or the foundation for where the virtue ethics can adhere itself to. So she goes on to say that no full-fledged theory of ethics is complete if it is merely emphasizes the importance of developing and consistently acting out of good character traits. And I think this is kind of a fair point for her to make and to go down. And it would be interesting to see maybe what a response to this would be.
Right. And so she wants to spell out now what a full-fledged ethical theory would look like. She says that a full-fledged ethical theory that emphasizes the virtues also needs an explanation of two things. Trait, a virtue, as opposed to a vice or, a morally neutral trait. And secondly, how to flesh out specific virtues. She says the theory should thus give us some indication of how to delineate generosity from, extravagance, for instance. So she wants to, that this is the idea of context that she's talking about, right? What is it that makes a particular trait a virtue? And then how do you flesh that out so that you can make some distinctions with regard to various types of traits or characteristics?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Very good questions to ask the virtue ethicist here. To understand the importance of providing explanations of the first one and of the second one, consider the fact that both Aristotle and David Hume were proponents of moral theories that could be classified as types of virtue ethics. So, of course, these two guys, Aristotle and David Hume, are going to be so at odds with each other. So it's interesting that she's pulling them together to say, well, if you want to be a virtue ethicist, then you also have to deal with the likes of people being in your camp that are the same but also different. And Aristotle and Hume are going to be figures, she says, that consider something like humility to not be a virtue but a vice. So humility is something that, of course, the Christian is going to look at and say, well, that was one of a main point that Jesus brought to us, especially in contrast with people of his day. And so, if we're going to be virtue ethicists and some of the people in our camp are saying that something like humility is a vice rather than a virtue, something that shouldn't happen, but and not something to be cultivated, then we have to you're going to have to deal with that. So she goes on to say that the question for Hume, Aristotle, and Kallenberg, and any other virtue ethicist is this: what rationale is being used to determine whether any particular trait, and by extension, humility in particular, should be classified as a virtue, a vice, or neither? So I'm hungry. Is that a virtue or a vice, or is it neither? I want to gorge on food. Is that a virtue, a vice, or is it neither? Well, is it always a virtue? Does it have certain restrictions for different time periods? And so all these questions come out that she's saying that virtue ethicists don't really have a clear, concise way of providing a standard by which you can classify these things. She goes on to say that no such rationale is forthcoming. We have been given no reason for thinking that the traits that the thinker in question calls virtues really are morally good, or that the ones she labels vices really are morally bad. So without that basis, you're kind of left at the whim of individualistic rationale of virtue. And if that's the case, well, then everyone did what was right in their own eye. So in the book of Judges, everyone is virtuous, right? So obviously Kallenberg is not going to hold to that view. And so he has to be able to provide more, which Peterson here is claiming that the role of the virtue ethicist isn't able to give you that standard. But she's saying, though, that the natural law does provide a good basis for that. And from there, you can be a good and virtuous person.
Right. And she goes on to say, thus, any ethical theory that emphasizes the virtues need to do more than simply argue for the moral significance of stable character traits, right? And provide a list of the traits that its proponents believe to be virtues. You need to do more than that, she suggests. She says to be complete, the theory needs also to explain why its proponents prefer traits, the traits that they prefer are virtues. Why are they virtues? And how we should understand particular traits. And And thus, she says, a rationale for classifying humility, for instance, as a virtue should also help us to at least begin to identify the key differences between, say, humility and low esteem, or even just low self-regard. What's the
Right.
difference? And how do we distinguish those, right?
Hmm.
You need to be able to do that. And so this is what she tells us she's getting at when she says that a complete ethical theory needs to identify a context for the virtues so that we can have a clear understanding of what we're talking about and what is a virtue and how we define it.
Hmm. Right. The needed context, in her opinion, is best provided by, of course, the natural law. So thus it is because humans are creatures designed for dependency on one another and worship of our creator and sustainer that humility is a virtue. So if we're to have kind of see in the world hierarchy and correct behavior within hierarchies, it wouldn't make sense for the farmer to pass laws because he's not a lawmaker, and so he can make these proclamations. But if no one's following them, then by definition, he's not a lawmaker. And so, if we're to understand kind of our role within the natural world in hierarchies, then the best way to understand the ultimate hierarchy is for us to understand the proper place of God and the proper place of humans. In fact, probably all of human failure is rooted in that inverse of viewing God at the very least not at the tippy top of all things. Similar comments about the necessary connection between human nature and the proper understanding of particular virtues and vices could be made about a host of other virtues and vices. So it's not just humility here, but in all these things, everything has to be put in their proper understanding in context with human nature. Thus, temperance in food and drink is not a matter of consuming an arbitrary number of calories per day, but temperance is rather fundamentally about approaching food in a way that is sensitive to our physical, social, and spiritual needs as human beings. And to take any one of those out is to not have that full holistic approach that she's wanting from a virtue ethicist. And so rooted in natural law, though, you can be the right person who does the right things for the right reasons. But for her, the grounding has to be in the natural law.
Right. And she says, while some virtue ethicists have turned to the natural law to identify the context for the virtues in the ways that she sketched out, other ethicists who place great emphasis on the virtues have looked outside the natural law and human nature, she says, for a context for the virtues. And she tells us to consider the following accounts of what makes a character trait a virtue that depart rather widely from natural law ethics. For instance, David Hume. He says that a virtue is defined as whatever mental action or quality gives to a spectator the pleasing sentiment of approbation, and vice, the contrary. Yeah. So that's what how he describes virtue. And she's going to explain this in just a minute. Mm-hmm. And then she looks at another example, Julia Driver, who as virtue is a character trait that produces more good actual world and not system, full of kind of definitions that she says attempt to give us, but those definitions outside of natural law ethics.
Right. All right. So what does it mean? Because Hume seems to be making everything that you could possibly want into a virtue. Well, she says that Hume thus believes that what makes a character trait a virtue is just widespread human approval. So, okay, maybe not individualistically, but if you get 51% of the population to say, oh, yes, this is a good character trait, then it is. Meanwhile, Driver's account...
We count noses, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. Oh, sorry, slavery. You're back on the table. More people today. Oh, man. So then with Driver's account is superior to Hume's in that generosity tends to make the world a better place. So, there you're doing the most good for the most number of people. is a more enlightening and plausible explanation of generosity's status as an actual virtue than Hume's. We tend to get happy when we think about generosity. Nevertheless, though, Driver's thoroughgoing consequentialist account of virtue is still inferior to a natural law-based account.
Right. So none of these work for her.
Right.
If we were to discover that a generally optimistic disposition and a keen wit, for instance, are both personally produce more good consequences than bad, it would not follow that these traits are actually virtues, right? She says a trait can be generally valuable without being an actual moral virtue. A virtue is necessary for human excellence. And so you can have a valuable trait or a good trait or whatever, but it's not necessary for human excellence. And therefore, according to what she's suggesting here, under natural law perspective, it's not a virtue. She says developing one's wit, for instance, is certainly one way to manifest excellence, but a keen wit is nonetheless not a virtue because it is not strictly necessary for human excellence. So that's where she is coming from with her definition of what a virtue is. It's a natural law kind of perspective. The virtues allow that are traits that are necessary for human excellence.
All right. Well, and her final contention here says that Kallenberg himself is comfortable describing his views using language of human excellence and the human telos. The end. What is the end purpose of humans? Natural law theorists are eager to use the same language. So what she says, what she has been at pains to establish is the best way to account for what truly constitutes human excellence is by reference to human nature and therefore the natural law. We simply cannot get clear and make an excellent human without getting clear on what humans fundamentally are and how they are assigned or designed to live. A virtue ethicist that relies on natural law for theological underpinnings need to identify and unpack the virtues is, for this reason, a promising theory. Which, of course, if she's going to say, by all accounts, I'm a virtue ethicist as well. She's wanting to root those ethics of the person into the natural law, and so she's a-okay existing alongside, but she's also propping up the virtue ethicist here.
Right. She's saying it's virtue ethics is good, but it needs a context in order to have a definition, and natural law gives the context for virtue ethics.
Right. What would you think of her response? Did she take it where she needed to?
So most of the criticisms, at least from most perspectives of virtue ethics, is this issue of how do you define the virtues? Yeah. That's the big issue for virtue ethics. Right. And of course, she notes that this is a big issue for Kallenberg. He really doesn't give us a way to define what the virtues are. And so she points that out. Now, she suggests that we can do that from a natural law perspective. The best way to do it, but that's what she's suggesting. Way to give context for virtue ethics, a way to define exactly what virtue is, and so that's where she's coming from.
Right. Yeah. That was my big question for when Kallenberg presented his argumentation is okay, but can you develop what you believe is virtue and then 30 years afterwards going, oh, wow, that wasn't worth it at all because now I have a different idea. So, it seems like you could have 6 billion virtually virtue ethic people. And so what is it that grounds it other than, the Christian word? And so it'll be interesting to see if the other responses interact with
yeah, well, actually, the next one, John Hare, is going to argue that the point that you just made, you can have 6 billion.
Right, yeah.
It's virtuous people that are different. He's going to argue that. It's going to be part of his argument.
Right. All right, so I think that's where we'll stop for today, so you can kind of get a handle on what it looks like that this book is doing. And then probably next time we'll cover the next two for our response to virtue ethics. And of course, you can find all the previous episodes now in its own playlist on YouTube. I believe I have the book, or if not, by the time this episode comes out, there will be the book in the middle of the page for you to check out for cavetocross.com. And so you can find all the previous episodes, starting with the very first one, the announcement, and working your way right to where you're at right now. And so you can find them all there. And of course, find them on any of your podcast catchers and Rumble, everything like that. Spotify now has video. I think it always has video, but for me, it now has video. So I've been working on getting our stuff uploaded there, so you can find it all there. All right, so next time we'll figure out if the other two theories have a good critique of the virtue ethics. And so, of course, we say thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.